I'm Alexa Peterson, 28, and I built my life from the ground up, graduated with honors, landed a stable career, and finally bought myself some peace. For years, I was the reliable one, bailing my brother Mario out of rent, rides, and every rough patch he stumbled into. But when he stood up at a family dinner and announced without asking that he'd be moving into my apartment, just until he got back on his feet, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been cornered or taken for granted by the very people you've sacrificed for? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line with family or stand up for yourself, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened after that dinner might surprise you. I learned early that being the responsible one meant cleaning up everyone else's messes. While my brother Mario stumbled through high school parties and weekend detention, I was home tutoring neighborhood kids for pocket money and organizing my college application essays by deadline. My parents called me their little adult, which felt like praise until I realized it meant I'd never really gotten to be a kid. Mario was 3 years younger, but somehow managed to make every family gathering about his latest crisis. Lost his job at the pizza place because he kept showing up late. Got kicked out of his apartment because he spent rent money on a motorcycle that broke down 2 weeks later. Each disaster came with the same sheepish grin and the same request for help getting back on track. "He's just finding himself," Mom would say, sliding another check across the kitchen counter while I watched from the doorway. Dad would nod and add something about how some people mature later than others, his eyes meaningful in my direction. The unspoken message was always clear: Mario needed patience, and I needed to provide it. The pattern started small. $20 here and there when Mario ran short on gas money. A place to crash for just a couple nights when things got tight. I'd graduated college with honors, landed a decent job in marketing, and moved into a tidy one-bedroom apartment that felt like freedom after years of dorm rooms and shared spaces. My place became Mario's emergency backup plan. "You're such a lifesaver, sis," he'd say, sprawled on my couch with his feet up on my coffee table, eating cereal from my bowls. "I'll pay you back once this new gig takes off." The new gig was always something vague: a friend's business venture, a band that was definitely going to make it this time, a landscaping company that existed mostly in his imagination. I covered his overdue rent more times than I could count. 500 here, 300 there, always with the promise that it was temporary. When his car got repossessed, I co-signed for a used Honda that he promptly rear-ended while texting. When that got towed for unpaid tickets, I drove him to job interviews for 2 months while he complained about how the employers didn't understand his potential. "Mario's going through a rough patch" became Mom's standard explanation at family barbecues and holiday dinners. She'd say it with the same tone she used to explain his bad grades in elementary school, as if irresponsibility were something he'd eventually outgrow, like a favorite t-shirt. Dad would change the subject to safer ground sports, weather, anything that didn't require acknowledging the obvious. My sister Clara found the whole thing amusing. She'd married her college boyfriend and moved to Portland, far enough away that Mario's problems felt like entertainment rather than obligation. "He'll figure it out eventually," she'd say during our phone calls, her voice light with distance. "And if he doesn't, well, at least he's your problem and not mine." She meant it as a joke, but the truth stung. The resentment built slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a jar. Every time I wrote another check, every time I listened to another sob story about why this crisis wasn't really his fault, every time my parents praised his creativity while taking my stability for granted, another layer accumulated. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was what families did for each other. I told myself I was being the bigger person. But watching Mario blow through opportunities that I would have killed for started eating at me. When he quit the marketing assistant job I'd helped him land because his boss was too demanding, I felt something snap. When he spent his first paycheck from the restaurant job on concert tickets instead of paying me back, the snap widened into a crack. "He's your brother," Mom would say whenever I hinted at frustration. "Family takes care of family." The implication was always that I was being selfish for expecting accountability, ungrateful for questioning the system that kept Mario afloat while I treaded water under his weight. The worst part was how he never seemed to appreciate the sacrifice. Mario treated my help like a utility, something that was just there when he needed it, like electricity or running water. He'd show up at family gatherings with stories about his latest adventures, the trips he'd taken with money he should have used for rent, the gear he'd bought instead of paying bills. Everyone would laugh and shake their heads affectionately while I calculated how much of his lifestyle I'd subsidized. "You're so lucky to have such a generous sister," relatives would tell him, and he'd nod absently, already thinking about his next request. Lucky. As if my help were a lottery win rather than a conscious choice to prioritize his needs over my own financial security. I started declining some family events, claiming work obligations or prior commitments. The truth was that watching Mario charm everyone while owing me thousands of dollars had become unbearable. My parents noticed my absence, but never connected it to their golden boy's behavior. They'd call to check on me, worry about whether I was working too hard, suggest I needed to find more balance in my life. Balance. I almost laughed at the irony. My life had been perfectly balanced around Mario's chaos for years, and they'd never noticed the weight distribution was completely lopsided. By the time I turned 28, I'd lent Mario close to $15,000 in various increments. He'd never paid back a single payment. When I brought up the money, he looked genuinely confused, as if borrowing and repaying were unrelated concepts. "I thought that was more of a gift," he said once, his tone suggesting I was being petty for keeping track. That's when I realized the real problem wasn't Mario's irresponsibility. It was my enablement of it, and my family's expectation that I'd continue enabling it indefinitely. They'd created a system where Mario's problems became my responsibility, and my sacrifice became invisible. The responsible one. The little adult. The lifesaver. All those labels felt less like compliments and more like chains, binding me to a role I'd never chosen but couldn't seem to escape. I was tired of being the solution to problems I hadn't created, tired of watching my brother coast through life on my pavement. Something had to change. I just didn't know yet how dramatically that change would arrive. The signs were there long before that dinner, scattered through family gatherings like breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable confrontation. Mario had been dropping hints for months, casual comments about how expensive rent was getting, how hard it was to find a decent place in his budget range. He'd mention my apartment with increasing frequency, always in connection with how nice it must be to have such a stable situation. "You're so smart about money," he'd say, eyeing my furniture, my electronics, the small luxuries I'd earned through years of careful budgeting. "I should learn from you." But his tone suggested he was less interested in learning than in accessing what I'd built. Mom started making comments too, subtle suggestions about how family helped family, reminders about how I had extra space that was just going to waste. My one-bedroom apartment apparently counted as excessive for a single woman in her mind, though she'd never said the same about Mario's various living situations. Even when he'd rented a two-bedroom place he couldn't afford and filled it with expensive gaming equipment. "It would be temporary," she'd say when I'd visit for Sunday dinner, as if the conversation about Mario moving in with me was already in progress. "Just until he gets on his feet." Those words, "getting on his feet," had become a family mantra, repeated so often they'd lost all meaning. Mario had been getting on his feet for 10 years. Clara weighed in during one of our phone calls, her voice bright with the particular enthusiasm of someone offering advice from a safe distance. "Maybe it would be good for both of you," she said. "You could keep an eye on him, help him develop better habits. And you'd have help with rent." I didn't point out that Mario had never successfully paid rent anywhere he'd lived. The pressure was subtle but constant, a steady drumbeat of expectation that I'd eventually see reason and open my door. My parents never directly asked me to take Mario in, but they'd discuss his housing struggles in my presence with theatrical concern, their voices loaded with implication. They'd mention how worried they were about him, how difficult the rental market had become, how nice it would be if he had somewhere stable to land. Mario started showing up at my apartment more frequently, always with some excuse: needed to borrow my laptop, wanted to use my printer, hoped I could give him a ride somewhere. He'd linger afterward, making comments about how comfortable my couch was, how convenient my location seemed for job hunting. Once, I found him measuring my living room with his phone. "Just curious about the layout," he said when I asked what he was doing. "This place has good flow." Good flow for what, I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer. The hints became less subtle as Mario's current living situation deteriorated. He'd been staying with a friend whose patience was wearing thin, bouncing between couches and spare bedrooms while his possessions accumulated in my parents' garage. His complaints about his temporary arrangements grew more pointed, always delivered with meaningful glances in my direction. I wouldn't need much space, he mentioned during a family barbecue, loud enough for everyone to hear. Just somewhere to sleep and keep my stuff while I save up first and last month's rent. Dad nodded approvingly. Mom made sympathetic noises. Clara, visiting from Portland, smiled like this was all very reasonable. I felt like I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. The script called for me to volunteer my space, my peace, my carefully constructed independence. The fact that I wasn't following along made me the problem, the selfish sister who couldn't see past her own comfort to help family in need. My friend Sarah was the only person who seemed to understand my position. "He's not your responsibility," she'd say when I'd vent about the mounting pressure. "You've already done more than enough." But even she couldn't shield me from the family consensus that was building around Mario's housing crisis. The conversations at family gatherings started revolving around Mario's situation with increasing frequency. Every meal became a strategy session about his next move, every phone call an update on his apartment search. The subtext was always the same. I had the solution, and my reluctance to offer it was becoming unseemly. "We're just worried about him ending up on the street," Mom said during one particularly pointed conversation. "It's not like we're asking you to support him forever. Just a place to stay while he gets organized." The word organized was doing heavy lifting there, considering Mario's relationship with organization had always been casual at best. I started dreading family events, knowing they'd inevitably turn into Mario intervention sessions where I was cast as both the problem and the solution. The weight of their expectation pressed down on me like a physical thing, making me feel small and selfish for wanting to protect what I'd worked so hard to build. But I also felt something else building alongside the guilt, a quiet anger that they'd cornered me into this position without ever directly asking what I wanted. They'd simply assumed my cooperation, taken my sacrifice for granted, and were now orchestrating a situation where saying no would make me the villain. Mario's housing crisis wasn't really a crisis at all. It was a manufactured emergency designed to leverage my sense of obligation. And despite seeing through the manipulation, I felt trapped by it, bound by family loyalty and the threat of being labeled the sister who'd let her brother become homeless. The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday. Mom called with her most cheerful voice, the one she used when she wanted something, but was pretending the request was spontaneous. "Why don't you come over this weekend? I'm making that chicken you like, and Clara's visiting with the kids. Mario will be there too." The emphasis on Mario's attendance felt loaded, but I agreed anyway. I hadn't seen Clara's children in months, and I missed the chaos of family dinners, even when they came with complications. I just didn't realize how complicated this particular dinner would become. The atmosphere felt different the moment I walked into my parents' house that Sunday. There was an electricity in the air, the charged feeling that came before important announcements. Mario was there early, which was unusual. He typically showed up halfway through dinner with some excuse about traffic or work running late. Today he was helping set the table, another deviation from his normal pattern. Clara hugged me with extra enthusiasm, her smile a little too bright. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "This is going to be such a great evening." The words felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play where everyone knew the ending except the audience. I should have recognized the setup then. Should have felt the trap closing around me as I took my seat at the table where I'd eaten thousands of meals, surrounded by people who'd spent weeks orchestrating this moment. But I was focused on Clara's stories about her kids, Dad's complaints about his golf game, Mom's fussing over whether the chicken was too dry. Normal family dinner conversation, except nothing about that evening was normal. I was walking into an ambush disguised as Sunday supper, and I didn't even know it yet. The moment came during dessert, after the dishes were cleared and the wine had made everyone relaxed and talkative. Mario stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through the conversation like a record scratch. He picked up his wine glass and held it high, grinning like a man about to announce his engagement. "I have some news," he said, his voice carrying that performative excitement people use when they want to make sure their announcement gets proper attention. Everyone turned toward him, faces expectant, and I felt my stomach tighten with an inexplicable dread. "I'll be moving in with my sister here," Mario continued, gesturing toward me with his free hand, "just until I'm back on my feet." The words hit me like cold water. Moving in. Not asking to move in, not requesting or hoping or wondering if it might be possible. Moving in. Past tense. Decided. Done. My parents erupted in approval. Mom clapped her hands together like Mario had just announced he'd won the lottery. Dad beamed and raised his own glass in a toast. "That's wonderful news," Mom said, her voice bright with relief. "Such a smart solution." Clara laughed and nodded, raising her wine glass toward me. "You're such a good sister," she said, as if I'd already agreed to something I'd never been asked about. "Mario's so lucky to have you." Lucky. There was that word again, transforming my theoretical sacrifice into his good fortune. I sat frozen, my fork suspended halfway between the plate and my mouth, watching my family celebrate a decision that had apparently been made without my input. The bite of apple pie I'd been about to take looked suddenly unappetizing, the sweetness cloying in my mouth as I tried to process what was happening. "To family taking care of family," Dad said, raising his glass higher. Everyone toasted except me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the faces around the table, all of them looking at me with expectation and approval, as if my agreement was so obvious it hadn't needed to be requested. Mario was still standing, still grinning, basking in the warm glow of family approval. "It'll be great," he said, looking directly at me for the first time since his announcement. "I won't be any trouble. Just need somewhere to crash while I save up money for my own place." The casualness of his tone was what broke through my shock. This wasn't a request or even an assumption, it was a fait accompli delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by his family. He'd announced his plans the way people announced vacations or job changes, as information rather than negotiation. "When were you thinking of moving in?" Mom asked, her tone suggesting the logistics were the only remaining detail to be worked out. Not whether I agreed, not what I thought about the arrangement, just when it would happen. "Next week would be perfect," Mario said, settling back into his chair like the matter was settled. "I've already started packing." Already started packing. The presumption was breathtaking in its completeness. He'd made plans, told our parents, organized a family dinner to announce the decision, and started preparing for a move, all without ever asking me if I was willing to house him. The conversation moved on to practical matters. How long he might need to stay, just a few months at most, according to Mario, though his timeline for getting on his feet had never proven accurate before. What he'd contribute to expenses, "I'll pitch in for groceries," he offered, though he'd never successfully managed his own grocery budget. How little space he'd need, "I'm not picky," he assured everyone, as if pickiness were the issue. I listened to my family plan my life for me, feeling like a spectator at my own intervention. They discussed my apartment, my schedule, my space, as if these were communal resources rather than things I'd worked for and paid for and chosen carefully. The presumption was complete and casual, wrapped in the language of family obligation and temporary hardship. "You two will have fun living together," Clara said, smiling at both of us like she was arranging a play date rather than a major life disruption. "Like when you were kids." We'd never lived together as adults, never chosen to spend extended time in each other's company, never successfully cohabitated even for short visits without friction. Mario nodded enthusiastically. "It'll be just like old times," he agreed, though our old times had mostly involved me cleaning up his messes and him taking credit for my work. The nostalgia felt manufactured, designed to make opposition seem churlish. I finally found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. "I wasn't aware we'd discussed this," I said, looking around the table for some acknowledgement that I'd been left out of the planning process. This is the first I'm hearing about it. The statement hung in the air for a moment, creating the first silence since Mario's announcement. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. Clara's smile flickered uncertainly. Mario's confidence wavered just slightly, as if it had occurred to him for the first time that his plan might have a flaw. "Well, of course we knew you'd want to help," Mom said finally, her tone suggesting my surprise was the strange part of this equation. "You've always been there for Mario when he needed you." The phrase felt like emotional blackmail dressed up as compliment, binding me to a pattern I'd never consciously chosen. "It's just temporary," Dad added, as if duration were my primary concern rather than consent. "Mario's got some promising leads on apartments. This is just to bridge the gap." Promising leads. Mario always had promising leads. They materialized and dissolved like morning mist, insubstantial and temporary. I looked at my brother, still glowing with the warmth of family approval, still confident in his reception. "You've already started packing?" I asked, focusing on the detail that bothered me most. The presumption of it, the complete certainty that I'd go along with plans made without me. He nodded, misreading my tone as interest rather than incredulity. "Just the essentials," he said. "I know you don't have a lot of extra space. I can make it work." Make it work. In my space, with my resources, disrupting my routine, but he'd make it work. The family was watching me now, waiting for my response, their faces showing the first hints of confusion that I hadn't immediately embraced the plan. They'd expected gratitude from Mario and cooperation from me. Anything else was outside the script they'd written in their heads. I set down my fork carefully, buying time while I tried to organize thoughts that felt scattered and urgent. The bite of pie I'd never taken sat on my plate, getting soggy while my family waited for me to play my assigned role in their drama. That night, I drove home through empty streets with my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath my feet. The dinner conversation replayed in my mind on an endless loop, each detail sharp and painful in its clarity. The presumption. The assumption. The complete absence of my voice in decisions about my own life. My apartment felt different when I unlocked the door. Smaller, somehow, as if Mario's impending presence was already crowding the space I'd carefully arranged for myself. I looked around at my living room, my books, my furniture, my deliberately chosen decorations, and tried to imagine it invaded by someone else's chaos. The couch where I read in the evenings would become his bed. The kitchen table where I worked on freelance projects would be cluttered with his belongings. The quiet sanctuary I'd created after years of shared dorm rooms and cramped apartments would be transformed into someone else's crash pad. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the dark, trying to process what had happened. My family had orchestrated an entire intervention around my supposed obligation to house my brother, complete with announcement dinner and fait accompli presentation. They'd planned everything except the part where they asked if I was willing to participate. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. By announcing Mario's move as decided fact in front of the entire family, they'd made saying no nearly impossible. Who could reject their brother in front of parents and sister? Who could be that selfish, that unwilling to help family in need? They'd created a situation where agreement was the only socially acceptable response. My phone started buzzing around 10 o'clock. Text messages from various family members, all variations on the same theme. Clara sent a string of heart emojis followed by, "So proud of you for stepping up." Mom wrote, "Thank you for being such a loving sister. Dad and I are so grateful." Even my aunt, who must have gotten the news through the family phone tree, chimed in with, "Family takes care of family." Everyone was thanking me for a choice I hadn't made, praising me for an agreement I hadn't given. The messages felt like a closing net, each notification another weight holding me to a decision that had been made for me. I turned off my phone and sat in silence, feeling more alone than I had in years. The worst part was the complete absence of doubt in their responses. No one questioned whether I was equipped to handle a long-term houseguest. No one wondered if my space was adequate or if the arrangement might disrupt my life. No one asked how I felt about the plan or whether I had concerns about Mario's history of failed living situations. They'd simply assumed I'd be grateful for the opportunity to sacrifice my independence for my brother's convenience. The responsible one. The little adult. The sister who always came through when family needed her. They'd boxed me into a role I'd never auditioned for and were now expecting me to perform it with enthusiasm. I thought about calling Sarah, but what would I say? That my family had ambushed me into housing my irresponsible brother? That I'd sat through dinner too shocked to object while they planned my life for me? That I felt trapped by their expectations and guilty for resenting them? None of it sounded reasonable when I tried to put it into words. But the anger was real, burning in my chest like heartburn. Anger at Mario for his presumption, at my parents for their manipulation, at Clara for her distance and easy judgment. Anger at myself for being so predictable that they'd never doubted my compliance. They knew me well enough to plan around my inability to say no, and that knowledge felt like betrayal. I'd spent years being the reliable daughter, the responsible sister, the family member who could always be counted on to do the right thing. The right thing, as defined by everyone except me. My wants and needs had become invisible in the face of other people's crises, my boundaries dissolved by the constant pressure of family obligation. The phrase kept echoing in my mind, just until I'm back on my feet. Mario had been getting back on his feet for a decade, stumbling from one crisis to another, while I provided the safety net that made his falls less painful. How long was just until? How many months of my life was I expected to sacrifice while he figured out what I'd known since college, that independence required discipline, that stability demanded consistent effort, that adults were responsible for their own feet? I refilled my wine glass and tried to imagine the alternative scenario. The dinner where they'd approached me privately, where they'd asked rather than announced, where my comfort and consent had been part of the equation. It felt like fantasy, a parallel universe where my family viewed me as a person rather than a resource. Instead, they'd cornered me with public pressure and social obligation, making dissent seem cruel and agreement seem inevitable. They'd hijacked my Sunday dinner and turned it into theater where I was both the audience and the unwilling star, expected to applaud a script I'd never seen. My friend Sarah had been right when she'd said Mario wasn't my responsibility. But my family had made him my responsibility through years of gradual expectation and implicit demand. They'd trained me to catch him every time he fell, and now they were surprised that I might want to stop being his perpetual safety net. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I didn't have to do this. I didn't have to open my door, disrupt my life, sacrifice my peace for someone else's poor planning. I didn't have to be the solution to problems I hadn't created, the bank that never demanded repayment, the sister whose generosity was taken for granted. I could say no. The word felt foreign in my mouth, strange and powerful after years of automatic yes. I could disappoint them. I could be the selfish sister, the family member who put her own needs first, the woman who refused to house her brother just because everyone expected her to. The possibility was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I'd built my identity around being helpful, reliable, the person others could count on. What would I be if I stopped being that person? Who was I underneath the role I'd been playing for so long? But sitting in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built for myself, I felt something shift. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something harder and cleaner. Determination. For the first time in years, I was going to put myself first. The family's disappointment would be painful, but their expectation that I'd sacrifice indefinitely for Mario's benefit was worse. Mario had made his announcement. Now it was time for me to make mine. The difference was that mine would actually be mine, not a decision made by committee and delivered as fait accompli. I was going to change the locks, and I was going to change the rules of a game I'd never agreed to play. The guilt would come later, along with the family pressure and the accusations of selfishness. But for now, in the quiet of my own space, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of putting my own needs first. It felt revolutionary. 2 weeks passed like a countdown to an explosion I was orchestrating in secret. I went through the motions of normal life, work, errands, conversations with friends while planning the most decisive action I'd ever taken. The locksmith appointment was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. The note I'd write would be short and direct, None of the lengthy explanations or justifications I'd draft and discard in my head. Mario had been texting regularly during those 2 weeks, casual updates about his packing progress and timeline. Should have everything ready by Saturday, he'd written. Thanks again for being so cool about this. Cool about it. As if I'd given him my blessing rather than sat stunned through his announcement. My family had continued their stream of appreciation messages, treating my silence as agreement and my lack of enthusiasm as natural modesty. We're so proud of how you're stepping up for Mario, Mom had said during our usual Wednesday phone call. This is exactly what family is supposed to do for each other. Family. The word had become weaponized, used to justify Mario's presumption and my expected compliance. Family meant I couldn't refuse, couldn't prioritize my own comfort, couldn't question arrangements made without my input. Family meant my boundaries were negotiable and my sacrifice was assumed. But family also meant I'd spent years watching Mario float from one disaster to another while I provided the safety net that made failure comfortable. Family meant my parents had enabled his irresponsibility by turning it into my problem. Family meant Clara could offer commentary from a distance while I dealt with the consequences up close. The locksmith arrived at 3 o'clock Thursday afternoon, a cheerful middle-aged man who changed my locks with efficient professionalism and no questions about why I needed the service. The new keys felt foreign in my hand, symbols of a choice I was still half convinced I couldn't make. But the locks were changed, the decision made material and irreversible. I spent Thursday evening writing the note, draft after draft, until I arrived at something that said everything necessary and nothing more. Mario, the locks have been changed. This arrangement was never discussed with me, and I'm not willing to house you. Good luck getting back on your own feet. Your sister. Simple. Direct. Final. Friday morning, I taped the note to my door and left for work early, knowing Mario wouldn't arrive until Saturday, but wanting the message in place. The physical act of taping paper to wood felt momentous, like planting a flag or drawing a line in the sand. I was claiming territory that had always been mine but never felt truly secure. Saturday morning, I turned off my phone and went to the farmer's market, then spent the afternoon at a coffee shop across town, reading and trying to imagine Mario's face when he found the changed locks and the note. The scene played in my mind like a movie I was both directing and trying not to watch. His confusion, then anger, then the phone calls that would start immediately and continue for hours. I'd expected guilt to overwhelm me by Saturday evening, but instead I felt something cleaner and lighter. Relief. The relief of finally acting instead of just reacting, of making a choice instead of having choices made for me. The relief of protecting something that was mine instead of watching it be handed away to someone else. When I finally turned my phone back on Sunday morning, the screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Missed calls from every member of my family, text messages that started confused and escalated quickly to angry, voicemails I could delete without listening to. The digital equivalent of shouting, all of it demanding explanation for an action that needed no explanation beyond the one I'd already given. Mario's messages were the most numerous, starting with genuine confusion. Did you change your locks? The key isn't working, and progressing through anger. What the hell is wrong with you? To manipulation. I can't believe you'd do this to your own brother. The progression was predictable, the same emotional cycle he'd used to get his way since childhood. My parents' messages carried disappointment and bewilderment. We don't understand why you do this, Mom had written. Mario is family. This isn't like you. But it was like me, the real me, not the accommodating version they'd trained me to be. The me who had needs and boundaries and the right to make decisions about my own life. Clara's messages stung the most because they came wrapped in the language of concern. I'm worried about you, she'd written. This seems really unlike you. Are you okay? The implication that protecting my own interests was a sign of mental instability rather than long overdue self-preservation. I read through all of it, the guilt, the manipulation, the concern trolling disguised as love, and felt the relief solidify into something harder. Certainty. I'd made the right choice, possibly the first truly right choice I'd made in my relationship with my family in years. The fact that they couldn't understand it didn't make it wrong. The phone started ringing again around noon on Sunday. Mario, probably calling from his car in my parking lot, trying one more time to charm or guilt his way inside. I let it ring, then blocked his number. Then I blocked my parents' numbers, and Clara's too. Not forever, but long enough for them to understand that their disappointment wouldn't change my decision. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own needs first, and the sky wasn't falling. My apartment was still quiet, still mine, still the sanctuary I'd worked to create. The guilt they'd tried to pile on my shoulders couldn't compete with the simple satisfaction of keeping what was mine. Mario would figure out his housing situation because he'd have to. My parents would be disappointed because they'd have to confront their role in creating this crisis. Clara would have to find new entertainment because this particular family drama was over. And I would finally learn what it felt like to live without the constant weight of other people's emergencies on my shoulders. The lesson was harsh but necessary. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to stop rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices. The phone kept ringing, but I didn't answer. I had better things to do than explain myself to people who'd never bothered to ask what I wanted before making plans for my life. I had my own life to live, finally, in my own space with my own rules. The guilt they'd counted on didn't materialize. Instead, I felt free. The first month after I changed the locks was the quietest my life had been in years. No emergency calls from Mario, no requests for bail money or rent assistance, no dramatic late-night appearances at my door with sob stories and promises to change. My apartment stayed clean, my bills stayed current, and my stress levels dropped to something approaching normal. I'd unblocked my parents' numbers after 2 weeks, but our conversations were stilted and careful, like we were all speaking a language none of us had fully learned. They'd ask about work and the weather, studiously avoiding any mention of Mario or my decision, as they'd started calling it. The elephant in the room was enormous, but we'd all agreed to pretend it didn't exist. "How are things going?" Mom would ask, her tone probing for signs that I'd realized my mistake and was ready to make amends. When I'd answer that things were going well, she'd pause like she was waiting for more information, some confession of regret or loneliness that would open the door to reconciliation. But I wasn't lonely, and I definitely wasn't regretting my choice. For the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for myself. I could leave dishes in the sink overnight without worrying about someone else's opinion. I could work late on freelance projects without apologizing for the noise. I could invite friends over without checking first to see if my house guest was home. Sarah noticed the change immediately. "You seem different," she said during one of our weekly coffee dates. "Lighter somehow. Less anxious." She was right. The constant low-level stress of being responsible for Mario's problems had lifted, leaving me with energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I'd started taking evening art classes, something I'd wanted to do for years, but had never made time for between Mario's crises and family obligations. The pottery studio became my weekly refuge, 2 hours where I focused entirely on the clay in my hands instead of other people's problems. My instructor commented on how quickly I was progressing, not knowing that my sudden aptitude came from finally having the mental space to concentrate fully on something that was just for me. 3 weeks after the lock change, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Mario. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard, before typing back, "Not yet." Then I blocked that number too. I wasn't ready for his apologies or explanations, wasn't interested in hearing about how hard things had been for him or how unfair I'd been to him. His problems were still his problems, and I was finally free from the obligation to solve them. The family grapevine eventually brought me updates whether I wanted them or not. Mario had crashed with various friends for a few weeks before finally landing in a studio apartment across town. According to Clara, who'd appointed herself the family information broker, he'd found a steady job at a warehouse and was doing okay considering. Considering what, she didn't specify, but I could fill in the blanks. Considering he'd had to figure out his own housing situation for the first time in years. Considering he'd been forced to live within his means instead of relying on his sister's subsidies. Considering he'd discovered that independence required actual effort. "He asks about you sometimes," Clara mentioned during one of our carefully neutral phone calls. "Wonders if you're still mad at him." The phrasing irritated me, still mad, as if my boundary setting were a temporary emotional state rather than a permanent change in how I related to his chaos. "I'm not mad," I told her, which was true. Anger required ongoing engagement, and I'd moved past engagement into something more sustainable: indifference. Mario's problems were no longer my problems, his failures no longer my responsibility to fix. "Maybe you could reach out," Clara suggested, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think they're being helpful. "He's really trying to get his life together." She meant well, but she was still operating under the old family system where Mario's efforts deserved praise and my boundaries deserved reconsideration. But I'd learned something important in those quiet weeks. Mario didn't need my help to survive. He needed my help to avoid the consequences of his choices, but when that help disappeared, he'd figured out alternatives. The catastrophe everyone had predicted, homelessness, joblessness, complete disaster, hadn't materialized. He'd simply had to grow up, finally, at 28. The realization was both liberating and infuriating. All those years of emergency loans and crisis interventions, all those times I disrupted my own life to bail him out of situations he'd created, none of it had been necessary. I'd been enabling his immaturity by making it comfortable, protecting him from consequences that might have motivated change years earlier. My parents' attitude toward me shifted as the weeks passed, and it became clear that I wasn't going to cave to guilt or family pressure. Their disappointment hardened into something colder, a distance that felt like punishment for refusing to play the role they'd assigned me. Family dinners became even more awkward, with pointed comments about loyalty and forgiveness that were clearly directed at me. "Some people think family obligations should take precedence over personal comfort," Dad said during one particularly uncomfortable Sunday meal, his eyes fixed on his plate, but his meaning unmistakable. "Others prioritize their own convenience above everything else." I'd sat through years of these passive-aggressive lectures, but this time I felt no urge to defend myself or smooth over the tension. "Some people think enabling irresponsibility is the same as showing love," I replied evenly. "Others think real love sometimes requires letting people face consequences." The table went quiet. Mom's fork clinked against her plate. Clara studied her napkin with sudden fascination. Dad's face flushed slightly, but he didn't respond. I'd broken the family's unspoken rule about direct confrontation, but I discovered I didn't care about their discomfort anymore. "I think we should change the subject," Mom said finally, her voice bright with forced cheer. But the subject had been changed already, permanently. They could disapprove of my choice all they wanted, but they couldn't undo it, and they couldn't guilt me into undoing it either. By the end of the first month, I realized that the family dynamics I'd grown up with, the assumption that I would always be available to rescue Mario, the expectation that my boundaries were negotiable, the belief that family loyalty meant infinite sacrifice weren't natural law. They were patterns we'd all participated in creating, and I could choose to stop participating. The guilt I'd been conditioned to feel about putting myself first was fading, replaced by something steadier: self-respect. I'd proven to myself that I could make hard choices and stick with them, that I could prioritize my own needs without the world ending. Mario was surviving just fine without me, and I was thriving without him. My apartment had never felt more like home. The space I'd protected from invasion remained mine, peaceful and organized exactly the way I wanted it. I'd learned that saying no to family wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And for the first time in my adult life, I was discovering who I could be when I wasn't constantly cleaning up someone else's messes. The freedom was intoxicating. I started making plans that extended beyond the next family crisis, thinking about goals that didn't include contingency funds for Mario's emergencies. I was learning to live for myself, and the person I was discovering was someone I actually liked. 3 months after changing the locks, I was finally ready to hear what Mario had to say. Not because I felt guilty or missed him, but because I was curious about what he'd learned during his crash course in independence. The text came on a Tuesday evening while I was grading pottery pieces from my intermediate class. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I owe you an apology. Can we meet for coffee?" I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Saturday afternoon. The coffee shop on 5th Street. 1 hour. No emotion, no warmth, just logistics. If he wanted to apologize, I'd listen, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made indoor spaces feel more welcoming. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and claimed a table in the back corner, somewhere we could talk without being overheard but public enough that the conversation would stay civil. Mario walked in exactly on time, which was already an improvement over his usual relationship with punctuality. He looked different. Leaner, maybe, or just more careful in his movements. The casual confidence that had always irritated me was gone, replaced by something more tentative. He ordered his coffee and sat down across from me without his usual sprawling claim on space. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, his voice formal in a way that felt rehearsed. "I know you don't owe me anything after what I did." What I did? At least he was taking ownership, though I wondered how long it had taken him to arrive at that phrasing. "What did you do, Mario?" I asked, wanting to hear him articulate it rather than letting him off with vague acknowledgement. He shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated by his coffee cup. "I assumed you'd take me in without asking if you wanted to. I announced it like it was already decided, in front of everyone, so you couldn't really say no. I took advantage of the fact that you'd always helped me before." The admission was more comprehensive than I'd expected. "And why do you think you did that?" "Because I could." The answer came quickly, like he'd already thought about it extensively. "Because you'd never said no before, so I figured you never would. Because I was desperate and scared, and it was easier to make it your problem than to deal with it myself." I sipped my coffee and considered his words. The apology felt genuine, but apologies were easy. "How did you deal with it yourself?" "Found a place the next week," he said with a rueful smile. "Turns out when you don't have a sister to fall back on, you figure things out pretty quickly. Got the warehouse job, moved into the studio apartment, started actually budgeting my money instead of just hoping it would work out." "Why didn't you do that before?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. "Because I didn't have to. You were always there to catch me when I fell, so falling didn't really matter. I could take risks and make stupid choices because I knew you'd bail me out if things went bad." The honesty was uncomfortable but necessary. "Do you understand why I changed the locks?" "I think so." He looked up from his coffee for the first time since sitting down. "You were tired of being my safety net. Tired of me treating your help like it was owed instead of appreciated. Tired of everyone, including me, acting like your life existed to solve my problems." It was more insight than I'd expected from someone who'd spent years oblivious to the impact of his choices on others. "What's different now?" "I know what it costs to live independently," he said. "Really know it, not just theoretically. When I mess up now, I'm the one who has to fix it. There's no backup plan that involves calling you for money or showing up at your door with a sob story." "And how does that feel?" "Scary," he admitted. "But also kind of good? Like I'm actually an adult instead of just playing one. My problems are still my problems, but at least they're mine to solve." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of years of dysfunctional patterns settling between us like dust. I could see he was waiting for me to say something to forgive him, maybe, or to indicate that we could go back to some version of our old relationship. But I wasn't ready for either of those things. "I'm glad you're doing well," I said finally. "But I need you to understand that things can't go back to the way they were. I won't be your emergency fund anymore. I won't be available for crisis management. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be one between equals, not between a rescuer and someone who needs rescuing." He nodded slowly. "I understand. And, honestly, I don't want to go back to the way things were either. It wasn't good for either of us." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. Can we try being siblings instead of whatever we were before?" he asked. "Like, actual siblings who care about each other but don't owe each other everything?" The question surprised me with its clarity. "Maybe," I said. "But it's going to take time. And it's going to require you proving that you can maintain this new version of yourself when things get difficult." "Fair enough." He drained his coffee and stood up. "I should go. Thank you for giving me the chance to apologize. I know I didn't deserve it." I watched him leave, noting the way he'd cleaned up after himself and left exact change plus tip on the table. Small things, but they suggested someone who was paying attention to details that had never mattered to him before. The apology hadn't erased years of resentment, but it had opened a door I'd thought was permanently closed. Not the door to my apartment that boundary would remain firm, but the door to the possibility that we could build something new and healthier from the wreckage of our old relationship. For now, distance still felt safer than trust. But for the first time since I'd changed those locks, I could imagine a future where Mario and I might actually like each other, where family could mean support without sacrifice, where helping each other didn't require one person giving up pieces of themselves. It was a start. A small one, but real. And it had only been possible because I'd finally learned to put myself first, to protect what was mine, and to let other people face the consequences of their own choices. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to stop making their problems easier to ignore. A year later, I was painting the spare bedroom I'd finally decided to create. Not for a houseguest, I'd learned that lesson thoroughly, but for a home office where I could work on the freelance graphic design business I'd started 6 months earlier. The pottery classes had led to an interest in visual arts, which had led to taking on small design projects, which had grown into something that might actually replace my day job within another year. The transformation felt symbolic. The space I'd protected from Mario's invasion had become the foundation for building something entirely my own. Every brushstroke on the walls was a choice I'd made for myself, every piece of furniture positioned exactly where I wanted it. My relationship with my family had evolved into something more honest, but less comfortable. We still had Sunday dinners, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. I was no longer the family problem solver, no longer the one everyone turned to when crisis struck. The role had been so much a part of my identity that losing it felt strange at first, like losing weight and having clothes that no longer fit. Mario and I met for coffee every few weeks now, cautious conversations that felt like negotiations between two countries that had recently ended a war. He'd kept the warehouse job and moved into a larger apartment, split with a roommate who actually paid his share of rent. When his car needed major repairs, he'd taken out a small loan instead of calling me. When he'd gotten food poisoning and missed 3 days of work, he dealt with the lost wages himself instead of asking for coverage. It's weird, he'd said during our last coffee meeting, being completely responsible for my own life. I keep waiting for something terrible to happen that I can't handle, but so far everything's been manageable. That's because you're managing it, I'd pointed out. Instead of assuming someone else will handle the hard parts. He'd nodded thoughtfully. I think I spent so long thinking of myself as the family screw-up that I never really tried to be anything else. It was easier to live down to expectations than to figure out how to exceed them. The insight had surprised me. Mario had never been particularly reflective before, but forced independence had apparently given him time to think about patterns he'd never questioned. The change wasn't just in his circumstances, it was in how he understood himself and his place in the world. My parents had slowly accepted that I wasn't going to return to my old role as Mario's backup system. They still occasionally made comments about family loyalty and forgiveness, but the heat had gone out of their disappointment. They could see that Mario was surviving fine without my constant intervention, and that I was thriving without the weight of his problems on my shoulders. "You look happy," Mom had said during our last phone call, and for once there was no undertone of accusation in the observation. More settled, somehow. She was right. I did feel settled, grounded in a life that was entirely my own creation. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for years, the low-level stress of waiting for the next Mario crisis, had disappeared. I slept better, laughed more easily, made plans without factoring in emergency funds for family disasters. Clara had been the slowest to adjust to the new family dynamic. She'd built her role as peacemaker around the assumption that I would always eventually give in to family pressure, and my permanent refusal to budge had left her uncertain how to navigate the changed landscape. "I still don't understand why you had to be so dramatic about it," she'd said during her last visit, referring to the lock change as if it had been theater rather than necessity. "You could have just talked to him." "I tried talking for 10 years, I'd reminded her. "Talking doesn't work with someone who's not listening." She'd shrugged, still uncomfortable with the idea that some problems couldn't be solved with enough discussion and goodwill. But even Clara had to admit that both Mario and I seemed better off in our separate lives than we'd ever been when mine was constantly disrupted by his chaos. The design business was taking off faster than I'd expected. Word of mouth had brought me steady clients, and I'd recently been approached about designing marketing materials for a local restaurant chain. The extra income meant I could finally afford some of the furniture I'd been wanting, could travel occasionally without worrying about maintaining an emergency fund for Mario's inevitable disasters. More importantly, success felt different when it was entirely mine. No one could claim credit for my client relationships or creative decisions. No one could guilt me into sharing resources I'd earned through my own effort. The business belonged to me completely, and that ownership was more satisfying than any paycheck. I was painting the office ceiling when my phone rang. Mario's name on the screen still made me pause, even after months of regular contact. The old habits of anxiety died hard. "Hey," I said, balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear while I set down the paint roller. "I have news," he said, and something in his tone made me pay attention. "Good news, I think." "What's up?" "I got promoted at the warehouse. Shift supervisor. More money, actual benefits, and it turns out I'm pretty good at organizing people and processes." I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. "That's great, Mario. Really great." "Yeah, it feels pretty good. I wanted to tell you because..." He paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "Because I don't think it would have happened if you hadn't changed those locks. I would have kept drifting along, taking the easy way out, never really pushing myself to see what I could do." The admission touched something in me that I'd thought was permanently closed off. Not the urge to rescue him that was gone for good, but something warmer. Pride, maybe. Not in what I'd done for him, but in what he'd done for himself once I'd stopped interfering. "You did the work," I told him. "I just stopped preventing you from having to do it." "Still, thank you for caring enough about me to let me figure it out on my own." After we hung up, I stood in my half-painted office and felt the weight of the past year settling into something solid and permanent. I'd learned that love didn't require sacrifice, that helping someone sometimes meant refusing to help them, that family obligations had limits that were healthy to enforce. The spare bedroom that had never housed Mario was becoming the foundation for a future I was building entirely for myself. The walls I'd painted were mine. The furniture I'd chosen reflected my taste. The success I was building belonged to me alone. I'd protected this space from invasion, and it had become the place where I'd finally learned who I was when I wasn't constantly managing someone else's crisis. The lesson had been painful but necessary. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to stop making their problems comfortable to maintain. Mario was thriving now because he'd been forced to develop skills he'd never needed while I was always available to catch him when he fell. And I was thriving because I'd finally learned to put my own needs first, to protect what was mine, to say no without guilt or apology. The responsible daughter, the reliable sister, the family problem solver, those roles were still part of me, but they no longer defined me completely. I picked up the paint roller and returned to my ceiling, each stroke covering more of the old surface with something new and chosen. The transformation was slow but steady, just like the reconstruction of my relationship with my family, just like the development of my own independent life. For the first time in my adult life, I was painting a future that belonged entirely to me, in a space that no one could claim or invade or assume they had rights to. The room was mine, the business was mine, the choices were mine. I'd learned to stand on my own feet, and I'd taught my brother to do the same. It had taken changing locks to change everything else, but the investment had been worth it. The door that closed on Mario's assumption that my space was his emergency option had opened onto possibilities I'd never imagined when I was constantly managing his crises instead of building my own life. The paint went on smooth and even, covering the old completely, leaving room for something entirely new. And that's how I finally drew the line. Changing the locks wasn't about cruelty, it was about finally protecting my own peace. What about you? Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with family? Did it change your relationship for better or for worse? Drop your story in the comments, I'd love to hear it. And if this hit home for you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who might need the reminder. You're allowed to protect your space.